You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. I'm excited to welcome back to the program one of our favorite guests, Slava Rabinovich, straight from Moscow. Slava, how are you?
I'm fine. How are you, Yuri?
I'm doing very well. You are one of, I think, most read bloggers in Russia, and I think it's kind of an honor and responsibility to some extent, because with the official information being so misleading and so limited, more and more people are turning to internet, social media, Facebook in Russia to get their news. How do you go through the process? You have things that are, what our president these days calls fake news. And of course, that's turning things upside down a little bit. But when you look at the amount of information that you are sharing with your readers, that people are consuming in Russia, what does the news diet of a Russian person look like?
Maybe that's the difference between bloggers and myself. I don't consider myself a blogger. I only write what I think, and I think what I analyze, and I analyze not for the sake of an analysis, but rather for the sake of what I'm doing for a living, and this is what I have been doing for over 20 years, meaning international financial investment, and in addition to my education, I also have this international financial world work experience and successful investments, and the ability to invest around the world is based on the analysis and based on the analysis of the real events, news, trends, and not on the analysis of fake news.
So is it really just about the fact that you have this knowledge and life experience that is helping you sort through things?
I think that's a big part of that.
All right. Slava, well, as an international financial investor, it's been 2 years since Boris Nemtsov was brutally murdered outside of Kremlin. It seems that he has gained more friends than he had while he was alive, since he has been gone. How do you feel that, now Senator McCain, Senator, I think, Graham, there's several American politicians who I've never heard mention Nemtsov's name before, who are just ready to talk about him at a drop of a hat, which is probably a good thing. So my question to you is, how has situation in Russia changed in the last 2 years since Boris Nemtsov was murdered?
Things in Russia have turned for the worse in a general sense. I think that Boris Nemtsov had quite a wide following internationally, including the U.S., and Senator McCain is mentioning his name in sad circumstances of Boris Nemtsov's murder 2 years ago, but I'm sure that Senator McCain knew Boris personally while before that. In terms of the Russian environment, 95% of what Nemtsov has been predicting what's going to happen in Russia is actually happening in Russia. And the initial euphoria of the broad masses of the population who have been poisoned by the Putin's official television propaganda, they slowly come to realization that the reality is hugely different from what they see on the television. So it has been visible in the number of not only trolls who used to clog up all the comments under any kind of a post or any kind of an article, and not only such commentary from trolls, but rather also from those people whose thought process was completely fogged up by what they have been singing on the television without the ability to analyze and think in abstract and in real terms and build basic relationships in terms of the cause and effect. These people are slowly they slowly come to realization that much of what have been put into their heads is complete garbage, and they trying to figure out what is real and what is not. But unfortunately, it's a very slow process, and we are probably now in perhaps 1/3 of that process. If this process were faster, then we would have been in over 2/3 of this process, which would have been a very good news 1 year prior to the next so-called presidential elections, which would have been very useful for the population at large to realize that these are not presidential elections. This is just yet another special operation, as I call it, special operation of inauguration of Putin. And if they were to come to this realization, they would have come out in the streets in mass, and that's what Putin's regime is afraid. I think Putin's regime is only afraid of people in the streets.
So only people on the streets. Other than that, nothing really matters because Putin is busy dealing with bigger and more fun things for him, like foreign policy. And that's where I guess let's point our direction there. We have the so-called Russian connection that's been extensively, thank goodness, more and more covered in American media. What is your perspective on this Russian connection, and to what extent Kremlin may be controlling our president and his administration?
Right. So this is yet another special operation to install Trump in the U.S. As a Kremlin's agent and to dismantle the statehood of the USA. Even if that were the intention of the Kremlin's bandits, it was done in the most funny way, and they would have received not a C but rather an F in the KGB school.
But didn't they succeed?
Well, the expulsion of Mr. Flynn from presidential administration with a scandal like that, which is unprecedented, really, for any kind of incoming administration throughout the history of the U.S. I think, in terms of the speed with how it happened, and the whole scale of this thing. When first they get into democratic email threads, then they speak with just about anybody, not only with members of the future Trump administration, but I don't know, with their
they've spoken with everybody.
Distant employees. They deny that. Then they try to install their own people whom they bribed, and it becomes public that they bribed them. And then just anybody out there is Putin's agent, and then they talk about Trump as their candidate for months on the Russian television, and then the Russian parliament is joyful and cracking open champagne bottles on November the 9th, the day after the election, and the one of the completely idiotic head of television channel RT, which is Kremlin's propaganda channel in various foreign languages. She tweets that she would like to drive around Moscow in her car with the American flag because they elected Trump and they deserve it.
And that would be really opposite of what we would expect. That's the opposite of what we would expect from an RT executive.
Right, but they are showing to the world that Trump has been installed by the Kremlin, and they are joyful about it. And this is called a special covert operation of the KGB to install Trump. So it is so idiotic and counter and serves completely opposite purposes of what they initially wanted. So now Trump is running away from, and has to run away from, all these Kremlin-related scandals, because they break out, if not every day, but seemingly just about every other day. And obviously the effect of all of this is absolutely opposite. Trump cannot do anything in terms of his promises and responsibilities to Putin, if there were any. And this seems like these people got an F in all of their operations in this context.
So that's an interesting irony that I guess I'm seeing, is that on one hand, KGB approach is that the end justifies the means. Whatever we have to do to get to our goal is fine, because we don't really, from KGB's point of view, they don't care about people, they don't care about rules, they don't care about any of those, quote unquote petty things, little details, as long as they get what they want. That's the one of the natures of KGB. But on the other hand, here they've accomplished what they wanted, but their fingerprints are all over everything, and that appears to actually defeat the purpose. Just the fact that it's visible.
You can word it in this way, but I wouldn't even say that much, because you're saying that they seemingly achieved their goal, but they didn't.
But I'm sorry, it's hard to say they completely failed when the president they wanted, the candidate they wanted, they were able to influence the public to the point that the public elected the candidate they wanted. I mean, they may not, their intentions may not be fulfilled with the candidate, but they were able to put the person, to help influence people to put the person there.
It's a matter of definitions.
It is true.
What
do we call it? What is a really human being? It's a matter of definition.
But what is the purpose of installing Trump as the president? The purpose was to have a great deal with Trump, so that the U.S. would recognize the annexation of Crimea, the U.S. would lift sanctions, and the U.S. would allow Putin to have his so-called quote-unquote legitimate interests in the sphere of the Russian influence. Basically, what they wanted is another Yalta Agreement, another Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, another under-carpet agreement for the division of the world. And first of all, no American president, even with no scandals and seeming ties to the Kremlin in the first place, would have been able to achieve all that from the U.S. side And Trump, as it may sound really ironic, is in the much more difficult position now on all of these points. So it doesn't really matter Trump or not Trump from this standpoint. It matters a lot for America and for the American people, whether it's Trump or not Trump. But what is really happening versus the Kremlin and Putin's context, installing Trump there serves purposes which are counter to their initial goals, because they failed in every single tick on the long list of what they committed along that road, and what has become public, and what has caused international scandals. And I'm sure that these scandals are not over, and these scandals have far-reaching consequences, which have by far have not played out in, at least in the U.S. in internal, not only internal politics, but in due legal process, I think.
So, Slava, if I understand correctly, then you're deeming the Operation Trump, so to say, from KGB's point of view, a failure because it wasn't about making sure that Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. It's about getting the United States to recognize Crimea annexation, and to also to let the world be divided in the way that Russia wants, so basically following Russian foreign interest. And since that's not likely to happen, the whole operation would be a failure.
Yes, and it's not only not likely to happen, it is less likely to happen with Trump, when everybody knows how and what Kremlin did in order for Trump to be elected. So it is completely opposite to what they wanted.
All right. You're listening to WSUW 91.7 FM, The Edge in Whitewater, Wisconsin. This is Rashkin Report, and I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin. I'm excited to welcome back to the program Slava Rabinovich, who is, an international financial investor with an extremely popular Facebook page. And not everybody can claim that. That, I think, is a pretty unique status. Slava, if you can, using your background, looking at the fact that Russian people, one of the differences between Russians and Americans is that in America people look at the price of oil at the gas station, and in Russia people look at the price of oil in terms of barrels. How much is a barrel of oil these days? And it seems like the prices are going down somewhat. Do you feel that this is really going to hurt Putin's regime that is so heavily dependent on its, sale of fossil fuels to finance everything that it does? Or do you feel that even in the low 50s per barrel, that if, $51 was what it's been, I think, most recently per barrel, Putin is still able to function and accomplish whatever his goals are?
Yuri, I think that the price of oil, as important as it is for the Russian economy and for the hard currency revenues that Russia gets, is a secondary factor to a primary factor, which is the definition of what is the economic and political system which took shape in Russia due to Putin's due to Putin's dismantling of capitalism. Putin dismantled the emerging capitalism in Russia, which started from somewhat mid-90s and continued through 2002. And he was constructing, and he was successful in building a bandit neo-feudalism. A very good example of the disconnect of the price of oil to the Russian economic growth relationship could be seen in 2013. And before that, of course, in 2008, when the first half of 2008 was associated with still rising commodity prices, and they were rising up to May and June of 2008. And in May of 2008, the price of barrel of oil reached $147 per barrel. A few months before that, in February of 2008, the Russian delegation to the World Economic Forum in Davos were bragging publicly there that while the rest of the world is falling into a global recession and the rest of the world started having difficulties in many areas, and by that time a couple of very large hedge funds already blew up that were investing in those instruments that later brought down Lehman Brothers and several other large institutions on Wall Street. And 1 month after that Davos World Economic Forum, in March of 2008, Bear Stearns, one of the oldest investment banks on Wall Street, failed, and it avoided full bankruptcy only because it was acquired by J.P. Morgan at a couple of pennies on a dollar. And still the Russians were bragging about Russia being a safe haven, being an island of stability, which of course was proven to be the most idiotic statement that a state delegation can say on the World Economic Forum in Davos, because at the end of the day, Russia did fail in being a island of stability. And moreover, when the world was in the global recession with GDPs of various countries falling by that much, and we can see the league tables of who lost what, Russia and Russian GDP fell by 9% in 2008, which was the most largest single drop among all, not only G8 by that time G8 economies, but among G20 economies, and among all countries that were included in BRICS, and so this was already failing Putin's economic model, which had nothing to do with capitalism, which had everything to do with a bandit neo-feudalism. Now, several years after that, Putin was lying in almost every of his speeches that was broadcasted on the Russian television, saying that Russian economic situation is not rosy because the entire world is in recession and all Western economies are in crisis, which was an absolute lie. In 2013, the US GDP was growing at the rate of 4%. At that time, the price of oil was $110 per barrel, and yet the Russian economy was growing exactly in the same year, in 2013, only at the rate of 1.3%, which was 3 times slower than the US. And even with this growth of 1.3% back then, the dynamics of this rate of growth was turning very, very negative, and it was absolutely clear that this 1.3% growth was just a statistical nothing in terms of what's going to happen very, very shortly, i.e. the growth of 0% or no growth, turning into negative, turning into economic um, recession. And Putin, of course, did not want to take responsibility for putting Russia into recession very, very shortly after the 2008 into 2009 crisis. He had no explanation, and he could not have any explanation why Russia is going into the second recession, while the entire world is actually growing, and while the world market for commodities that Russia was exporting was actually booming.
So is it all about corruption?
Well, first of all, Putin did not want to take the responsibility, so he decided to change gears and to change the agenda on the Russian state propaganda. And he invaded Crimea and annexed it, changing agenda into this schizophrenic imperial euphoria with a fake pseudo-patriotic kind of foam at the mouth. And
But it did really help him split the opposition, because there were lots of people who were opposed to Putin before Crimea, and the Crimea question has splintered the opposition, because some were saying that Crimea is ours, and some remain that Crimea is not ours, and that patriotic wedge has really been very effective.
Well, he split nothing
Okay.
because those who started yelling Crimea is ours, this is not a real opposition. This is, I'm sorry to say, bullshit, because if you have Putin's regime and if you have the opposition, the definition of the opposition is that these opposition leaders and their followers have to demand the change of the Russian political, legal, and economic environment into most and foremost the rule of law.
So,
The
so if
annexation
they
of
opposed, if they supported annexation of Crimea, then they're not opposition by definition. Is that what you're
they're
saying?
not. They're not, because they are supporting a brutal and violent breaking of the international law and of the Russian law, and it has nothing to do with the rule of law. And there will be nothing. I mean, the whole notion of democratic and capitalistic society is the rule of law. And once you deny yourself and you deny others the rule of law, there is no democracy and there is no capitalism. So this is not an opposition. Every single person who was saying about themselves that they were in the opposition, but they are not opposing the annexation of Crimea, is not the opposition. They are the same bandits of a different color.
All right. Slava, the last area that I really wanted to kind of get your opinion on, once again, you mentioned World Economic Forum at Davos in Switzerland. You know, this is where the super wealthy get together every year and have pleasant conversations about the world. This is like the new world order, in a way. And Steve Bannon, who is Donald Trump's clearly most powerful advisor, is no fan of Davos. He wants, he is anti-Davos. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin has showed that he really, I think that's one of his big goals, is to be like, a respected man at that gathering. So how does that work together when you have your man in Washington who says all these nice things about you, his main advisor hates the thing that you love? Is this where they can just kind of work things out, or do you think that this is a part of the problem that Russia is facing with the failed Trump operation? How do you look at those kind of disconnects?
Well, I don't know whether um, all of your listeners would be of the same thought process as I am, but my thought process is the following. The Trump administration and those who are close to him, they, in one way or another, they are generally anti-establishment. And whether it's the genuine belief or whether it's just a political posturing and the way to actually achieve their own goals and to be elected in the first place, um, this is their stance. And one can say that I am against Davos, I am against the establishment, and all of this further rhetoric, maybe just the means to do their own act and achieve what they want, and to create an alternative establishment, or go the same path of the what we would call a regular establishment, and maybe line up their pockets in the process. By the way, we haven't even yet seen Mr. Trump's tax returns, and we don't even know what his position was and is in terms of his personal finances.
But at least to be fair, his personal taxes is one issue that is coming up almost at every time, every conversation that involves Donald Trump, which is a good sign, I think.
Yes. But on the Kremlin side, well, first of all, I don't even remember exactly when was the last time Putin was at Davos, because it is clear that, especially after his 2007 so-called Munich speech, which raised a lot of eyebrows around the world, portraying his kind of inner workings in a great contrast to what many people thought about him before that. I think since then he became less and less and less acceptable as a conventional counterparty among decent people, so to speak.
So
By
now,
2000,
Putin is not invited to Davos because he's not decent enough for them, and Steve Bannon doesn't like Trump because it's not his establishment, as you know, as you pointed out. So maybe this is their common bond, is that they both don't like Davos, but for different reasons.
no, but Putin actually does believe in various conspiracy theories, as do
Perfect.
people in his as in his kind of among those who are close to Putin. He believes in the secret world government. He believes in various conspiracy theories behind Rockefellers and Rothschilds of this world having this world conspiracy which actually rules the world. He believes in Bilderberg's Club and all of this BS that, in fact, most people in the Kremlin and around the Kremlin believe in. And so his secret by now admiration and desire to be in Davos is only driven by this belief. It's not driven by any kind of reality that is played out in Davos and elsewhere.
So he wants to be in Davos to hobnob with people that he thinks really run the world, and the reason he believes in this conspiracy is because he doesn't want to take a look in the mirror, basically, and figure out that maybe the reason people don't want to play with him is because he's a bully.
Well,
I mean, because when you have somebody who is really, I mean, it's, with all due respect to you, to me, Putin is in a different situation than we are. He is much better informed about what's going on in this world because he's like functioning in the top leadership level of decision makers for the planet to some extent. And for those kinds of person, the same as for Donald Trump to say, well, to say that somebody else is running things is really kind of an interesting way of abdicating responsibility, doesn't it?
Well, I think you're not quite correct in your understanding of Putin's mental abilities. You are assigning
And
too much of
that's why I only
it.
host the show.
I think that, well, first of all, that's what I wanted to say when you said the word bully, and I stopped for a second to actually formulate. He's not a bully anymore by any kind of international standards. He's a international terrorist and a war criminal, and these kind of words are are said on the level of the United Nations. He has been also dubbed a murderer, a mass murderer in the U.S. by a very respectable U.S. journalist during the conversation with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump seemed not to actually deny that. That's my take on your incorrect definition of the word bully, and on the Putin's intellectual abilities. I think he's just a dumbass. That's all he is. If he
Well,
weren't a dumbass, he would have created a different system of kleptocracy, not this kind of kleptocracy that we have now. His existing kleptocracy is a kleptocracy where he cannot exit power. Nobody from among his close friends can exit power without being either jailed or, in fact, killed. All of the assets that they have stolen, most of them are not wanted in the world anymore. They are not being laundered, and they're not being legitimized. And these assets also cannot be safely owned and cannot be safely given to their children and grandchildren. If he were not a dumbass, he would have created something of a Russian version, Eastern European, somewhat European/Asian version of Saudi Arabia, which is vastly different from the Russia of today. The U.S. and Russia, in the context of this Saudi Arabian Russian version state, would have been America's biggest ally in this part of the world. There would have been a very close relationship and friendship. Russian money would have been welcomed not only all around the world, but also in the U.S. in the most favorable manner. And this is what Putin could have created if he wanted to become the most powerful. Well, not the most powerful, but at least the most wealthy person in the world. Instead, he probably became the most wealthy person in the world, but with all of those, structural deficiencies, to put it mildly, for his own wealth, for his own status, and for the status of his friends, and for the status of the whole country. And mind you, I haven't even started talking about how Russia should have been without Putin in terms of democratic system and capitalism. I only talked about what specifically Putin could have done. but he did it in the most idiotic way, and that's because he's a bandit and he's a dumbass.
So not a bully then. All right. I mean, perhaps, it just seems like our definition of the word bully in America keeps getting expanded and shifted, but it hasn't previously included international terrorists, so we'll go with that. So it's international terrorist and murder and other things you've said. Slava, thank you so much as always for being on the program. You always bring such a great perspective. Let me ask you in conclusion, if people are listening to this and want to do something, to change the situation, the protests are becoming a very popular thing in this country, and of course, ultimately there's voting. Which I think is really the key here. But anything that you wish the listeners would do if they care about the situation in Russia and the United States to make it better?
Well, the listeners are voters, and the listeners are represented in the U.S. Congress and Senate by the congressmen and Senate members from your districts. And so we would all benefit by Putin's regime failing faster rather than not as fast. And you should go to them and tell them that they want congressmen and senators to put pressure on both houses of the U.S. Parliament and on the president to actually expand sanctions against Putin's regime by introducing much wider personal sanctions against a much wider number of Putin's cronies, so that we could have 2,000 people under personal sanctions in Russia, and have extra 200 people added to that list every 2 or 3 months, so that by the certain lapse of time we have 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people under personal sanctions. And once we have these people under sanctions, they will find a way to do away with it, with this bandit Putin as the head of Russia, who is really threatening the world in our modern context of the 21st century by the modern equivalent of Adolf Hitler. And I think that America at large and every single person almost underestimate how dangerous Putin and his regime are. And so therefore, I think that much wider personal sanctions will expedite the fall of this criminal gang.
Slava Rabinovich, international financial investor, quite a popular blogger these days in Moscow, Russia. Thank you for joining Rashkin Report once again via Skype from Moscow and sharing your very important perspective with our listeners. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to 91.7 FM, WSUW, in Whitewater, Wisconsin. You're listening to Rashkin Report.